The first time Charlotte Garrison pulled on her dead brother's clothes and pressed his Pony Express rider's badge against her palm. She told herself it was only until she figured out another way. But the truth was, she already knew there was no other way. And the wind coming off the Nebraska plains that April morning of 1860 smelled like the only future she had left. Her brother Daniel had been 22 years old when a rattlesnake spooked his horse on the road outside Fort Kearny, and the fall had taken him before sunset. Charlotte had sat with him through those last hours, holding his hand while the light left his eyes, and he had whispered to her about the route, the stations, the horses, the mochila he carried, the pay that came every 2 weeks. He had told her all of it in the way dying men tell the things they wish they had said sooner. He had no wife, no children. Their mother was dead 3 years past, and their father had drunk himself into the Missouri River the winter before that. There was nobody to collect Daniel's wages, and there was nobody who would let a 20-year-old woman ride the express even if she had been riding since she could walk. Charlotte had been riding since she could walk. She was not a large woman, which helped. She was lean and strong in the shoulders from years of ranch work, and her hair, when she braided it flat and tucked it beneath a wide-brimmed hat, could pass for a young man's careful tidiness. She had Daniel's papers. She had Daniel's registration card with the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company. She had his horse, a tough little bay gelding named Jasper who had survived the fall without serious injury. And she had, lodged somewhere beneath her ribs where ordinary feelings lived, a kind of desperate fury that had nowhere else to go. She registered as Charlie Garrison at the Fort Kearny home station, keeping Daniel's nickname, and the man behind the desk barely looked up from his ledger. He was not Graham Merritt. Graham Merritt was at a different station entirely, and Charlotte would not meet him for another 3 weeks. But those 3 weeks would shape everything that came after, and so it is worth telling them true. The first ride was terrifying in a way that had nothing to do with the physical danger. Charlotte had ridden across harder ground with worse weather closing in, but she had always ridden as herself, and riding as a ghost, as a name borrowed from someone she had loved and lost made every mile feel like trespassing on sacred ground. She picked up the mochila at Fort Kearny, threw it over her saddle without stopping, and kicked Jasper into his long, ground-eating gallop. The mochila was heavier than she expected, and it shifted on the first curve, and she corrected without thinking, her body doing what years of practice had trained it to do. By the time she reached the swing station at Plum Creek, 10 miles out, she had found her rhythm. By the time she reached her first home station exchange, she was breathing easy. The rider at the next station looked at her with a young man's casual lack of interest and took the mochila and was gone in under 2 minutes. Charlotte watched him go and felt something settle in her chest that might have been grief, or might have been purpose, or might have been both things wearing the same face. She rode the Nebraska section of the route for 3 weeks, the stretch between Fort Kearny and Cottonwood Springs, alternating rides with 2 other riders who paid her no particular attention, beyond the normal collegial indifference of men who share a hard job. She learned the terrain the way she had always learned things, by paying close attention and never asking for help unless the alternative was dying. She learned which horses at which stations had bad habits with mud, and which swing station keepers kept good grain, and which ones were stingy with it. She learned to bind her chest tightly in the mornings not out of vanity or fear, but because a loose binding shifted on a galloping horse and became a distraction she could not afford. She learned that exhaustion at speed felt different from exhaustion at rest, that it made the landscape shimmer at the edges, and that the only cure for it was to focus on the point 10 yards ahead of the horse's nose and nowhere else. Then, on a Tuesday in early May, the company transferred Charlie Garrison to the section west of Chimney Rock, where the station master at a place called Merritt's Crossing was reportedly having trouble with rider turnover and needed a reliable hand. Merritt's Crossing was not an official name. It was what people called the home station because of the man who ran it. Graham Merritt was 28 years old when Charlotte rode in on a Tuesday evening, with the sun turning the bluffs behind the station, the color of old copper. He was standing outside the main building with a tin cup of coffee and a frown aimed at a fence post that had clearly been giving him trouble, and Charlotte's first impression of him was that he was the kind of man who fixed things himself rather than complaining about them, which she recognized because she was the same kind of person, and it always showed in a person's posture. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had been sun-lightened at the tips, and a beard kept close and neat in the way men kept beards when they could not afford to be fussy about appearances, but had enough self-respect to maintain basic order. His eyes were the color of the Missouri in early spring, that particular gray-green that looked like whatever color the light happened to be. He looked at her as she rode in, taking in Jasper and the way she sat him with the practiced assessment of a man who had been looking at horses and riders his whole working life. "You must be the new rider," he said, not a question. His voice was low and direct, the kind of voice that did not waste sound. "Charlie Garrison," Charlotte said, and her own voice came out steady, which she was proud of. She had been practicing the register she had settled on, not forced low, not performatively rough, just the quieter end of her natural speaking voice, the way she had always spoken when she was tired or thinking hard. "Graham Merritt," he said, "I run this station. Get your horse settled and come inside. Cook's put supper on." That was the beginning of it, though neither of them knew it in the way you only know beginnings when you are looking back at them. The station at Merritt's Crossing was a solid operation, better than most Charlotte had seen on the route. The barn was tight against weather, the hay was good quality, the spare horses were well fed and regularly exercised. There were 4 men besides Graham who worked the station. A cook named Esperanza, who was the wife of one of the stock hands, a stock hand called Pete, who was somewhere in his 50s and moved slow, but never made a mistake, a young man of 19 named Teddy who swept and hauled and was learning to shoe horses, and another full rider named Marcus Webb, who was 25 and treated Charlotte with the same indifferent respect the other riders had shown, which was to say, he acknowledged that she existed and left it at that. Charlotte shared sleeping quarters with Marcus in a bunkhouse attached to the main building. This was the part she had feared most about the deception, but it turned out the bunkhouse had 2 separate corners partitioned off with canvas, and Marcus Webb was a deep sleeper who snored and showed no interest whatsoever in the habits of his bunkmate. Charlotte learned to change quickly and quietly in the dark, and to rise before Marcus, and the arrangement held. Graham Merritt in those first weeks was professional and thorough, and a little distant in the way of men who are responsible for the safety of others, and have learned that closeness makes that responsibility complicated. He debriefed riders when they came in, asking about trail conditions, whether any signs of trouble on the route. He maintained meticulous records in a leather-bound ledger. He doctored horses with a competence that made Charlotte respect him immediately, because she had grown up doctoring horses, and she could tell the difference between someone who had read about it and someone who had done it with their hands. He gave Charlotte harder sections of the route after her first 2 rides without incident, which she understood was a compliment, and he said so plainly, "You're solid in the saddle. I'm giving you the canyon section on Thursday. It's the worst stretch. We have loose shale on the north approach and a creek crossing that runs high this time of year. You comfortable with that?" "Yes," Charlotte said. "Most riders argue with me about that section." "I'm not most riders." He looked at her for a moment with that gray-green assessment of his, and something moved in his expression that she could not quite name. "No," he said, "I can see that." She rode the canyon section on Thursday and came back with 10 minutes to spare on the schedule, which no one had done before. She knew it was 10 minutes to spare because Graham was standing at the station entrance with his watch open when she came in, and he looked at the watch and looked at her and closed the watch and put it back in his pocket without comment. but she saw the small shift in his expression that meant he was impressed and was choosing not to make a scene of it. That evening, for the first time, he asked her to sit with him on the station porch after supper and share a cup of coffee, and she did. They talked about horses first, because horses were safe ground for both of them. He had opinions about the quality of the remuda the company was providing, and she agreed with most of them and argued politely about the rest. And he listened to her arguments without the particular kind of dismissiveness that men often had in those years for anyone who disagreed with them. He actually changed his mind about one point mid-conversation and said so directly, which she found startling and then immediately admirable. They talked about the route next, about the geography of it, the way the land changed west of Chimney Rock into something that felt prehistoric and enormous. Charlotte had grown up in Missouri and come west with her family when she was 12, and the plains had never felt threatening to her the way they did to people who arrived from settled country. She told him this. "Where'd your family settle?" he asked. "Nebraska, little town outside Beatrice." She had to be careful here because the question of family was where the story of Charlie Garrison diverged painfully from the story of Charlotte. "It was just me and my brother mostly. Our parents are gone." "Your brother, is he still in Nebraska?" "He's gone too," she said, and the truth of it hit her behind the sternum in the way it still sometimes did. "Last month. It was an accident." Graham was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening plains where the last light was pulling itself down behind the horizon. "I'm sorry," he said, and he said it the way some people say it, not as a social formula but as a real statement of feeling. "That's a hard thing." "It is," Charlotte said. After a moment she asked him about his own family, partly to move the conversation away from her own, and partly because she genuinely wanted to know. He had grown up in Ohio, he told her, the second son of a man who ran a hardware business. He had come west at 23 because the hardware business felt like dying slowly and the West felt like living fast, and he had worked 3 years of cattle drives before the express company had offered him the station master position. "Do you miss Ohio?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Mostly I miss green. Real green, the kind that's everywhere at once and takes it for granted." He looked out at the moonlit plain. "But then I look at this, and I think there's nothing in Ohio that looks like this, and I stop missing it so much." Charlotte looked out at the same landscape, the bluffs dark against a sky so salted with stars it seemed almost to have weight, and felt the first warm thing she had felt since Daniel's death, which was the unexpected pleasure of talking to someone who saw the same beauty in the same place. She went to bed that night thinking about his gray-green eyes. The weeks that followed had a quality she would later struggle to describe to people, because they were at once deeply routine and quietly extraordinary. The riding was the work hard, relentless, occasionally frightening when the weather turned or the horse was green, or the trail was worse than reported. But the spaces between the riding were filling up with Graham Merritt, and she had not planned for that. He had a habit of appearing wherever a difficult task was being done, not to supervise but to help. She found him in the barn at 5 in the morning one day, resetting a shoe on one of the spare horses, working by lantern light with the focused patience of someone who understood that the horse did not care what time it was. She picked up the other tools without asking and held them ready, and they worked together for an hour in the pre-dawn quiet, and when they were done he looked at her across the horse's back and said, "You know what you're doing." "My brother taught me," she said. Which was true, though it was the other way around. She had taught Daniel, who had always been better with numbers than with horses. Another morning she came in from a hard ride through heavy rain to find that Graham had coffee waiting and dry clothes set out, her spare shirt from the bunkhouse, which she had not asked anyone to fetch, and the small thoughtfulness of it made her throat tighten in a way she had not expected. She thanked him. "You're my best rider," he said, matter-of-factly, pouring the coffee. "It's in my interest to keep you functioning." "That's a very practical way to put it," she said. He smiled then. It was the first real smile she had seen from him, not the small professional expressions he wore during work but a real one, that transformed his face entirely and created a line at the corner of his left eye that she immediately wanted to press her thumb against. "I can be practical," he said. "I noticed," she said. He looked at her a moment over the rim of his own cup, and she looked back, and something passed between them that was too specific to be general and too new to be named. Marcus Webb left at the end of May. His contract was up and he was heading to California, and he shook Charlotte's hand on the way out and said, "You're a strange one, Garrison, but you're a good rider," which she accepted as the highest form of praise Marcus was capable of. With Marcus gone, Charlotte had the bunkhouse to herself. The relief was significant. She moved her things into Marcus's corner, which had a better view of the door and a patch of wall where someone had once nailed up an old newspaper illustration of the Rocky Mountains. And she felt, for the first time since arriving at Merritt's Crossing, that she could breathe a full breath. Graham hired a replacement rider in mid-June, a young man of 21 named Henry Bowman, fresh from Missouri and very green, who looked at the horses with the expression of someone trying to appear more comfortable than he was. Charlotte, at Graham's quiet request, took Henry out for his orientation ride, showing him the section she had come to know better than any other rider on it, pointing out the places where the trail was deceptive and the places where it was only as hard as it looked and no harder. "You ride like you were born on a horse," Henry said, watching her take a difficult creek crossing without hesitation. "Almost," Charlotte said. Riding beside Henry, explaining things, pointing out landmarks, she felt something she had not expected. She felt like herself. Not like Charlie Garrison, Daniel's ghost, but like Charlotte, the woman who had grown up on the Nebraska plain and loved horses above almost everything and had a mind that was always mapping the ground beneath her and the sky above and the fastest line between where she was and where she needed to be. Graham had been watching her longer than she knew. The night it happened, the night he found out, was in July. It was the kind of July night the plains produced without apology, the air hot and electric, a storm building in the west with a seriousness that made the horses restless. Charlotte had come in from a ride 2 hours ahead of the storm and had gone to the bunkhouse to wash up and change before supper. She had been careless, because the storm was making everyone restless, and because she had begun, without fully realizing it, to feel safe in this place in a way that had loosened her vigilance by small degrees over the weeks. She had not heard Graham come into the barn, which connected to the bunkhouse by a short passage. She had not heard him come down the passage because the thunder in the west was already audible, a low rolling that masked small sounds. She had been in the middle of unwinding the binding from her chest, because after a long, hard ride it ached and she needed a few minutes free of it before rewinding when she heard his step in the doorway. She turned. He stood there. The lantern light was between them, and there was nothing ambiguous about what he was seeing. The silence lasted what felt like a very long time. In reality, it was perhaps 5 seconds, but those 5 seconds had the density of much longer intervals. The thunder rolled again in the west. One of the horses in the barn shifted and blew softly. Charlotte did not cover herself in panic, because panic would have been the worst response. She stood still and met his eyes directly, because whatever came next, she intended to face it as herself. Graham Merritt's expression went through several things in rapid succession that she tracked as carefully as she tracked terrain on a new route. The first was simple surprise, uncomplicated and human. The second was a kind of rapid recalibration. She could see him moving through what he knew and resorting it against what he was seeing. The third was something she had not anticipated, a long, careful look at her face as if he was seeing her for the first time and finding that he recognized her anyway. He said her name, not Charlie. He said, "Who are you?" "Charlotte Garrison," she said. Her voice was steady. She was very proud of that. "Charlie was my brother's name, Daniel Garrison. He died in April. I took his registration. I'm sorry I deceived you." More silence. Outside, the first fat drops of rain began to hit the ground, still widely spaced, the scouts ahead of the main storm. Graham stepped fully into the bunkhouse and pulled the door closed behind him against the rising wind. He did not do it in a threatening way. He did it the way a person closes a door against the weather. "The canyon section," he said slowly, "the early times, the way you handle a green horse." He was not saying these things as accusations. He was saying them in the voice of a man whose understanding of a story he thought he knew was being entirely reconstructed from the foundation. "You've been the one doing all of it." "Yes." "You're the best rider I have," he said, and then he said it again, not as repetition but as discovery. "You are the best rider I have ever had on this route." Charlotte had been prepared for anger. She had been prepared for confusion, for disbelief, for demands that she leave before morning. She had not been prepared for that. "I can still ride," she said, because it was the most important thing. "I have been riding. The company doesn't need to know, or the company will eventually need to know," he said, and there was something complicated in his voice, something that was not yet fully formed. "But that's not what he stopped. He rubbed the back of his neck with his right hand, which she had come to recognize as the thing he did when he was thinking hard and unsatisfied with the options his thinking was producing. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat on the edge of the bunk. He sat on the trunk opposite, and they looked at each other across the small space with the storm arriving outside and the lantern swaying slightly in the draft from the ill-fitted window. "Tell me from the beginning," he said. She did. She told him about Daniel, about the accident, about the weeks of helplessness that had followed the grief that had no outlet, the financial reality that had no solution, the Pony Express wages that represented the only income she had any claim to, and that no one would pay to a woman, even if the woman was the one doing the riding. She told him about the first ride, and the fear of it that had been entirely about the deception and not at all about the riding. She told him about the canyon section and the creek crossing and the shale on the north approach, and as she talked about those things, her voice lost its careful evenness and became something else, something that was genuinely alive and engaged, because those were the parts she loved, those were the parts that were purely her. Graham listened to all of it without interrupting. The storm hit in earnest as she talked, rain hammering the roof with real violence, lightning throwing blue-white shapes through the gaps in the shutters, and neither of them moved. When she was finished, there was a silence that was different from the earlier silences, fuller somehow and less frightened. "I should be angry," he said. "You have every right to be." "I know I do," he looked at his hands. "I'm not though, or I am, but not about the part I expected to be angry about." He looked up at her. "I'm angry on your behalf, that this was the only way you could see to do it." Charlotte had not expected that either. She felt something give way in her chest, not a bad giving way but a structural one, the way a building settles when it is finally on solid ground. "I didn't plan to stay this long," she said. "I thought a month, maybe 2, and then I would move on and no one would be the wiser." But she hesitated. "But," he said, and his voice had gentled in a way that made it dangerous to her composure. "But I like this route," she said. It was true, and it was also not the whole truth, and he probably knew it. "I like you on it," he said simply. They sat with that for a moment, the rain making the world outside into a single continuous sound. "What happens now?" Charlotte asked. Graham was quiet for a long moment. "Tomorrow," he said carefully, "I am going to write in my ledger that Charlie Garrison continues to be the best rider on this section of the route. I'm going to continue to schedule you for the canyon section and the early mornings and the bad weather rides, because you handle them better than anyone I have ever seen." He paused. "And I'm going to figure out the rest." "The rest," Charlotte said. "You can't keep living in a bunkhouse indefinitely," he said. "You can't keep—" He stopped again, and she saw the careful, practical machinery of his mind working through a problem that had no clean solution in the world as it was currently organized. "There are things I need to think about. Give me until morning." She nodded. He stood. He looked at her one more moment with that expression she still could not fully name. It was many things at once, and one of them was something she had never had directed at her before, something specific and wondering and a little undone. Charlotte, he said. It was the first time he had used her real name without the last name attached, without it being a statement of discovery. Just her name in his voice. Yes, she said. Good night, he said, and he left. She did not sleep. She lay in the bunk listening to the rain diminish and then stop, and the silence that followed was so complete after the storm that she could hear her own heartbeat. She went over the conversation the way she went over new trail in her mind, checking every section for where she might have gone wrong and finding, to her surprise, that she had not gone wrong anywhere she could identify. She also went over the look on his face when he had said her name, and that was the part that made sleep impossible. Morning came in the way mornings do after summer storms, washed and specific, every detail clarified by the cleaned air. Charlotte was up before dawn, out in the barn seeing to the horses, which was what she always did when she could not sleep and needed her hands occupied. She was working a knot out of the bay mare's tail when she heard him come in. He looked like he had not slept either. He stood in the barn entrance with his coffee cup and looked at her working the mare's tail with patient, careful fingers, and his expression had in it something she recognized now, something that matched what she had felt looking at that July sky from the porch weeks ago, when she had first understood that she was looking at the same beauty he was looking at and feeling the same thing. I've been thinking, he said. I know, she said. She kept working the knot. The mare stood with the patience of a good animal. The company is going to find out eventually, he said. Someone will talk, or the wrong person will ride through, or there are too many variables, and when they find out they'll discharge you. That's just the truth of it. I know that too, she said. But I don't want you to go, he said. There was no qualification in it, no careful hedging. It was a direct statement of feeling from a direct man, and it landed exactly the way direct things do when you have not been expecting them. Charlotte finished with the knot. She smoothed the mare's tail and stepped back and looked at Graham. The morning light was coming in through the open barn doors, and it was the gold and rose light that comes after storms, and it made everything look the way things look in the moments before they change permanently. I don't want to go, she said. Then we have a problem, he said, and there was something in his voice now that was not distress, but rather its opposite, a kind of determined intelligence being aimed at a problem it intended to solve. Because what I want to say to you has nothing to do with the express company's regulations, and those two things are going to need to be in the same conversation. Charlotte felt heat in her face, which was unfamiliar and not unwelcome. What do you want to say? She asked. Graham set his coffee cup on the railing of the nearest stall and crossed the barn to stand in front of her. He was perhaps 2 feet away, close enough that she was aware of his height, and the way the morning light hit the side of his face. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the night before when he had said her name, that multiple layered look that contained many things and was choosing carefully which one to say first. In the 3 months you've been at this station, he said, I have had more conversations I cared about than in the 3 years before it. I have watched you ride a route that scares other men into quitting, and I have watched you do it the way you do everything, which is with a complete and unself-conscious competence that I find. He stopped. He was not a man who struggled with words as a general rule, and the struggling made him more real to her, not less. I find extraordinary, he said. I find you extraordinary, Charlotte. Graham, she said. His name in her mouth was a new thing, and she watched him react to it. I know the timing is terrible, he said. And I know you have reasons to distrust every institution that exists right now, including this company and including any arrangement that depends on other people's approval. But I'm asking you to trust me anyway. I want to find a way to make this. He gestured between them and at the station and at the world outside. I want to find a way to make all of this work, if you want that too. I want that too, Charlotte said, without hesitation. He reached out and took her hand, the hand that still had horsehair on it from the mare's tail, and he held it the way you hold something you intend to keep. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at his face and felt the last, careful wall that she had been maintaining since April come down. They stood in the barn with the morning light and said nothing else, because nothing else was needed yet. What followed was a particular period of quiet happiness that Charlotte had never had before in her life, and that Graham, she came to understand, had not allowed himself to have either. They were careful with each other in the ways that people who have been mostly on their own are careful, thoughtful, a little tentative, constantly surprised by the ease of the other's company. Charlotte continued to ride. Graham continued to run the station. Between those things, in the mornings and the evenings and the long, slow stretches of summer afternoon, when the world seemed to pause and reconsider itself, they found each other. He taught her things about the station's operation that she had not known: the bookkeeping, the supply ordering, the relationship with the company's divisional superintendent, a man named Collins who came through every 6 weeks and who Graham described as a fair man if you give him no reason to be unfair. She taught him things about horses that he thought he knew but had learned differently, and the conversations that resulted were some of the best she had ever had, because they disagreed productively, and both of them came out of the disagreements having learned something. He had a way of listening that she loved. Most people listened in order to respond. Graham listened in order to understand, and there was a difference in how it felt to be the person being listened to. They were not without difficulty. There were moments when Charlotte felt the full weight of the situation, the deception still in place with the company, the knowledge that Collins would be coming through in August, the reality that her future on this route was not hers to determine. Those moments hit her sometimes in the middle of a ride, in the stretch of trail where she had nothing to do but think, and they had a quality of dread that the physical dangers of the route never produced. She told Graham about those moments one evening on the porch, and he listened in his way, and then he said, "Collins is a fair man. But I also know that fair men in 1860 have a limited definition of fair. So what I want to do before he comes through is write to the company directly." Charlotte looked at him. "About me. About my best rider," he said. "About performance and reliability in the canyon section times. I want to put it all in writing officially on the record before Collins arrives. I want the superintendent's office to know what this station produces before they know who is producing it. And then tell them who is producing it. And then tell them, yes." He looked at her steadily. "I won't ask you to keep lying. I won't build anything on a foundation I'm not willing to show in daylight." Charlotte felt in that moment the specific sensation of being fully known by someone and not diminished by it, actually expanded by it, as if being seen clearly made her more real rather than less. "You'd risk your position," she said. "I'd risk my position," he agreed. "But I don't think I will. I think Collins will read the record and make a decision that the company can afford to make, which is to keep the best rider they have on the route they have her on." He paused. "And if he doesn't, we'll figure something else out." "We," Charlotte said. "We," he confirmed, and she believed him. He wrote the letter. It was 3 pages, detailed and factual, citing specific rides and times, and weather conditions and the improvement in the station's overall performance metrics since Charlie Garrison. He used the name, because the name was still the name, had been assigned to the western section. He read it to her before he sealed it, and she listened with her hands folded in her lap, and felt the careful intelligence of the man she had come to love demonstrated in every measured sentence. He sent it with the next eastbound rider, and then they waited. Collins arrived in August, 3 weeks after the letter. He was a lean man of about 50, with the face of someone who had spent 30 years outdoors, and the eyes of someone who had been keeping accounts for 20 of those years. He rode in on a gray horse, and dismounted with the efficiency of a man who did not waste movement, and he shook Graham's hand, and looked at the station with the assessing look of someone doing a job. Charlotte was there. She was dressed as she always dressed, Daniel's clothes, the braid beneath the hat, but she stood differently than she had before Collins arrived. Graham had asked her how she wanted to handle it, and she had said she would stand there as herself, as Charlotte, and let the conversation find its own shape. Graham had nodded and not argued with her. Collins went through the books first, as he always did. Charlotte knew this from Graham's description of previous visits. He would spend an hour with the ledger, and then they would talk about the route, and then apparently there would be supper and Collins would leave the next morning. What happened instead was that Collins closed the ledger after his hour and looked up at Graham and said, "Your performance numbers on the western section are the best in this division." He said it without preamble, the way a man who has been reading numbers says things when the numbers have told him something unambiguous. "Thank you," Graham said. "Your rider, Charlie Garrison." Collins looked at the closed ledger. "I got your letter." "I expected you did." Collins looked up and across the table at Charlotte, who was standing near the window. He looked at her for a long moment with the experienced eyes of a man who had been looking at riders for years, and she looked back at him without moving. "You rode the canyon section in 3 hours 40 minutes in April," he said. "In a north wind." "Yes," Charlotte said. "And the creek crossing in June when the creek was running 4 feet above normal." "Yes." Collins was quiet. Outside, Pete was moving hay, and the sound of it was domestic and ordinary and entirely mismatched with the weight of the moment inside. "The express company does not employ women riders," Collins said. He said it the way you say a fact that is true regardless of your feelings about it. "I know that," Charlotte said. "It is not company policy because the company believes women cannot ride," Collins said, still in that same careful voice. "It is policy because—" He stopped. He looked at the ledger, then at Charlotte, then at Graham, then back at Charlotte. "It is policy because it has always been policy, which is a different reason and a worse one." "Yes," Charlotte said, "it is." Another long silence. Graham had not moved. He was watching Collins with the calm of someone who had made his case and was now waiting for the jury. "If you were a man," Collins said slowly, "your record would have you in line for a route supervisor position within 2 years. "I'm not a man," Charlotte said, "but I ride like one by your standards. And by any standard that matters, which is whether the mail gets through." Collins looked at her steadily. "The mail has been getting through," he said. "Yes," she said. "It has." Collins stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the station yard for what felt like several minutes but was probably 30 seconds, and then he turned around. "I cannot put Charlotte Garrison on the company's official roster," he said. "That is a line I cannot cross, not because I lack the will but because the authority to cross it sits above me, and I'm not prepared to lose my position over a policy change I cannot enforce." He looked at Graham. "However, a station master has considerable discretion in his personnel arrangements. The company pays for results. The results from this station are exceptional." He paused. "I did not see anything today that gave me cause for concern about how those results are being achieved." Graham said, quietly but clearly, "I understand." Collins looked at Charlotte. "You'll continue to ride under the current arrangement," he said. "The record will show what the record shows. If anyone asks me specifically, I will not lie. But no one is going to ask me specifically because the performance speaks for itself, and no one argues with performance in this business." He picked up his hat from the table. "I'll have supper now if the offer stands." "Esperanza's put a roast on," Graham said. "Good," Collins said, and that was the end of it. Charlotte stood very still for a moment after Collins moved toward the door. Graham came to stand beside her, and she felt his hand find hers briefly, just a moment, just the warmth of it, before they both followed Collins out. At supper, Collins asked Charlotte about the creek crossing in June, and she told him, and he listened with the genuine interest of a man who loved the logistics of difficult terrain. And by the end of the meal, they were discussing the best approach to the North Shale section, with the enthusiasm of two people who had the same obsession wearing different faces. Graham watched this from across the table with an expression that Charlotte, catching it in the lamplight, recognized as pure contentment. Collins left the next morning. As he mounted, he looked at Charlotte standing in the yard. "Best rider I've seen on this division," he said, "possibly on any division." He did not say it as a concession. He said it as a fact. Then he rode east, and the station exhaled. The weeks after Collins's visit had a different quality than the weeks before. Charlotte felt the decompression of long-held tension leaving her body like water leaving saturated ground after a rain slowly, completely, and with the relief of something that had been carrying too much for too long. She rode. She came back. She sat with Graham on the porch and talked about everything and nothing, and the conversations were easy in the way that conversations are easy when you have stopped performing and started simply being. She told him about Daniel. She told him the real Daniel, not the outline of a dead brother she had offered before, but the actual person. The way he had tried to teach her arithmetic, and she had been better at it than him, and they had both pretended otherwise because it made him feel better. The way he had laughed, which started as a kind of wheeze and escalated into something uncontrolled and hilarious. The way he had talked about the express route with a brightness in his eyes that she had understood even then was the brightness of a person doing what they were meant to be doing. He loved it, she said. The riding, the freedom of it, the idea that the mail got through because of him specifically. She was looking at the horizon, where the late August sun was doing complicated things with the clouds. I think I understand that now from the inside. I think you were always meant to ride this route, Graham said. I think Daniel would agree with me. Charlotte looked at him. He was looking at the same horizon she had been looking at, and his profile in that light was something she had begun to memorize without intending, to the line of his nose, the set of his jaw, the way he kept his mouth slightly compressed when he was thinking, and let it relax when he was at ease. And that it was relaxed now told her something that she already knew, but that she liked knowing again. Graham, she said. He turned. She kissed him. It was neither of their first kisses as a matter of historical record, but it was both of their first kisses of consequence, the kind that rearrange the architecture of your understanding of what you are doing with your life. He was still for a moment in the way of someone receiving something unexpected and wanting to make sure they understood it correctly. And then he was not still at all, and his hand came up to the side of her face with a gentleness that she had not anticipated from hands that she had watched do hard work. When they separated, the horizon was the same, and the crickets were beginning their evening conversation in the grass, and the world had not changed except that it had entirely. I have been wanting to do that, he said, since May. May, she said, that long. The night you came back from the canyon section and you were soaked to the skin, and you told me the creek was higher than I'd said it would be, and you were right. He said it with the small smile she loved. I find competence very appealing. I recognize this may be a specific quality in my character. I find it endearing, Charlotte said. He laughed, a real laugh, easy and warm, and she tucked it away alongside the way he said her name and the way he looked at the horizon. Autumn came to the Nebraska plain like a guest who does not knock. One day the grass was summer brown, and then overnight it was the bronze and amber of a world shutting in for the cold. The riding changed with the season. The creek crossings were easier now that the summer rains were done, but the mornings were punishing in a different way, the cold hitting the face at speed in a manner that made the eyes water and the fingers slow. Charlotte had ridden every season, and she knew the autumn adjustments, the extra layer, the different grip on the reins when the fingers were cold, the attention to the horse's footing on ground that was beginning to harden and become less forgiving. Graham came out with her warming drink before every early morning ride without being asked. She noticed this and did not comment on it except to thank him, because it was the kind of thing that was best acknowledged simply and not made large. Henry Bowman, the young replacement rider, had gotten competent over the summer and was now reliable on the easier sections, which freed Charlotte for the harder ones. Henry had figured out that something was different about Charlie Garrison but had arrived at the wrong explanation. He had concluded, as she gathered from overheard conversations with Pete, that Charlie was just a very private and somewhat mysterious person, which was not inaccurate, merely incomplete. October brought with it a development that Charlotte had not anticipated. A man arrived at the station one Thursday afternoon on a lathered horse, not a company rider but a private traveler, and he was looking for Charlie Garrison with a specificity that tightened Charlotte's chest the moment she heard Pete's voice carrying across the yard. She came out of the barn to find a man of about 40, weathered and broad, with a sheriff's badge on his coat. His name, he told her, was Turner. He was out of Beatrice, Nebraska. He had been tracking the use of a deceased man's express credentials. Charlotte looked at him across 10 feet of hard-packed station yard and felt the moment with the same attention she paid to difficult trail, mapping it, measuring the distances, assessing the footing. Graham had come out of the station building. He stood to the right of Charlotte, and she felt him there without looking. "I'm Charlotte Garrison," she said, before Turner could say anything further. "Daniel Garrison was my brother. He died in April. I took his credentials because I needed to work and there was no other way to do it. I've been writing this section since April. You can speak to the divisional superintendent, Collins is his name, about my record." Turner looked at her. He had the look of a man who had ridden a long way expecting one kind of problem and found a different kind. "There's a question of fraud," he said, carefully. Not aggressively, she noticed carefully. "There is," Graham said from her right, and his voice had the quality it had when he was about to state something he had already decided. "And I'd refer you to the letter I sent to the company in July, which is on record with the superintendent's office. I reported the situation fully, and the superintendent made his decision about the operational arrangement. Whatever legal question remains exists upstream of my station." Turner looked at Graham. He looked back at Charlotte. He was clearly doing the arithmetic of a situation that had more variables than his ride from Beatrice had accounted for. "The company's not pressing charges," Turner said finally. "Collins, yes, I've spoken to Collins. He told me he'd already handled it." "Then what brings you here?" Charlotte asked. Turner had the expression of a man who is going to admit something slightly uncomfortable. "Honestly, I wanted to see for myself. The woman who rode the canyon section in 4 hours flat. My brother-in-law runs a swing station on that section. He's been talking about it since April." There was a pause. 3 hours 40 minutes, Charlotte said. Turner blinked. "The canyon section," she said. 3 hours 40 minutes, not 4. Turner looked at her for another moment, and then he laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh that broke the tension of the afternoon like a stone through ice. He stayed for supper. He told them that Daniel Garrison had been well liked at Fort Kearney, that people had grieved him, and that the story of his sister taking up his route was, in Turner's estimation, the kind of story that Nebraska could use more of. He did not say he approved of it from any official standpoint. He simply said it was a story, and that stories like it were the ones people told their children. He left the next morning, and Charlotte watched him go and felt the last thing she had been afraid of ride away with him. That evening, Graham asked her to walk with him. They went out past the station yard, past the corral, to the top of the low bluff east of the station where the view opened up across the plain in all directions, the autumn sky enormous overhead, and the horizon impossibly distant in every direction. He stopped there and turned to face her, and the look on his face was the most open she had ever seen it, all the careful, practical composure still present but arranged differently, around something that was not careful or practical but was entirely real. "I've been thinking," he said. "You're always thinking," she said fondly. "I'm thinking right now," he said, "that I would like to ask you to marry me, but that I am uncertain of how to do it in a way that gives you the full choice. Because I know that you've spent this year doing the thing that most felt like yourself, and I don't want to ask you to trade that for something smaller." Charlotte looked at him. The wind was moving the grass in the long way it moved in autumn, not the violent summer gusts but the steady, persistent wind that was honest about what it was. "What would I be trading?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "That's the problem. The company's arrangement with Collins is it holds for now, but Collins won't be superintendent forever. And a married woman, especially a married woman who," he stopped. "Who is known," Charlotte said. "Who is known," he agreed. "Graham," she said. "I have been riding this route for 7 months disguised as my dead brother. I have crossed that creek in June and the shale in wind and the mud section after 3 days of rain, and I have done it because I could and because it needed doing, and because it made me feel more like myself than anything else I have ever done." She looked at him steadily. "I am not going to stop being that person. But I also know that the thing I feel when I am sitting on that porch with you in the evenings is not smaller than the writing. It is the same size. It is exactly the same size, and I would like both things if I can have them." Graham looked at her for a long moment, and she watched the last of his careful uncertainty leave his face. "Can I ask you then?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Ask me." "Charlotte Garrison," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I will." He put his arms around her there on the bluff with the autumn plain stretching out around them, and held her in the way of someone who was done being careful about something, and was now simply doing it with his whole self. And she felt the solid warmth of him, and the specific rightness of it that she had been aware of approaching for months, and that now arrived fully and settled into place like a key in a lock. They were married in December at the station. Esperanza decorated the main room with dried wildflowers. She had been saving all autumn for exactly this purpose, which told Charlotte that the wedding had not been as much of a surprise to the people at the station as she had thought. Pete wore his good shirt and stood very straight. Henry Bowman cried, which he denied afterwards and which Charlotte never mentioned again out of genuine affection for him. Collins sent a letter of congratulation that arrived 2 days before the ceremony, and that Graham read aloud at the supper table to the general approval of everyone present. There was a circuit preacher who came through the county once a month, a man named Aldridge who had the thin, dedicated face of someone who took his calling seriously, and the unexpectedly warm eyes of someone who liked people. He married them in front of the station's assembled household, with the winter light coming through the windows at that low-angled December slant that made everything look solemn and clean. Charlotte wore her own clothes for the first time in 8 months, a dress that Esperanza had quietly sourced from a dressmaker in the nearest town, a blue wool that was practical and warm and the right color for her dark hair, which was no longer braided flat beneath a hat but loose and pinned up in the way she had worn it before April. She felt strange in herself for approximately 10 minutes and then felt entirely herself, because it turned out that the self she had found riding the canyon section in Daniel's clothes was not a self that required those clothes, just a self that had been permitted by those clothes, and she carried it in her own dress without losing a single piece of it. Graham looked at her when she came into the room with the expression of a man seeing the woman he already knew completely, and also seeing her somehow, for the first time. He did not say anything, because they were already in front of Aldridge and the assembled household, but he gave her his hand and his eyes said what his voice was not saying, and she received it. Aldridge said the words. Graham said his words. Charlotte said hers steady, clear, meaning all of them. The plain outside was white with the first real snow of the season, and the world was very quiet around the small warmth of the station room. They put a ring on her finger, a simple band that Graham had ordered months ago from a silversmith in the nearest town, which told her something about how long he had been thinking about this. It fit perfectly, which was either luck or very careful attention to detail, and knowing Graham, she suspected the latter. Esperanza had made a cake that was not particularly beautiful and was extremely delicious, and they ate it with coffee and the rough bourbon that Pete produced from somewhere unspecified, and it was, Charlotte thought, the best meal of her life in the way that meals are best when they are surrounded by the right things. That night, lying awake in the room that was now theirs together, Graham had been sleeping in the station's separate back room since her arrival, and they had never discussed the sleeping arrangements as such but had moved into them naturally and completely on their wedding night. Charlotte listened to his breathing and the wind and the silence of the snow-covered plain outside, and felt a completeness that she had not known she was missing until she found it. She still rode. That was the part that some people, hearing the story later, found surprising, that she had married the station master and continued to ride the express route. But it was not surprising from the inside, and Graham had never suggested otherwise. She rode the western section through the winter, which was the hardest riding she had ever done. The cold was a different category of opponent than anything she had faced in the warmer months, and the horses behaved differently in deep cold, tighter and more reactive, and the footing on the frozen ground required a quality of attention she had not previously needed at those speeds. She loved it. She loved it the way you love a thing that is hard in a way that matches the particular shape of your capabilities, that tests exactly the things you are strongest in, and leaves you exhausted in a satisfying rather than a depleted way. She came home from those winter rides to the station and to Graham, and the specific pleasure of moving from that cold into the warmth he kept, the coffee, the fire, the way he listened when she reported on the trail conditions, was a pleasure that compounded rather than diminished over time. He was learning new things too. With Charlotte's input, he reorganized the stable routine at the station in a way that improved the horses' conditioning significantly, which improved ride times across the board. He wrote to Collins about it, and Collins wrote back with the enthusiasm of a man who loved efficiency. And the exchange began a regular correspondence between Graham and Collins about station operations that Graham sometimes read aloud to Charlotte in the evenings, and that she sometimes annotated in the margins, which made Graham laugh and write the annotations into his reply as though they were his own ideas, which she did not object to because she understood why and because the result was that the stations actually improved. Spring came back to the plain, April again, the green appearing at the edge of things, the horses restless and wanting to run. Charlotte had been pregnant since February, which was a fact she had known for 6 weeks before she told Graham because she was still working through what it meant for the riding, and she did not want to have the conversation before she knew what she was going to say in it. She told him on a morning when the first real warmth was in the air and they were out in the corral together, working with a young horse that had come to them green and frightened, and was becoming something else under their combined and complementary approaches. She said it plainly, the way she said most things. "I'm going to have a child, probably in October." Graham stopped what he was doing with the young horse and looked at her. His expression moved through something complex and arrived at a place that was unmistakably happiness, not a performed happiness but the real kind, the quiet and capacious kind. "Charlotte," he said. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "You probably do," he agreed. "And I know what you're going to say back, so let's skip to the part where we figure out what makes sense." "The riding," she said. "I want to keep riding through summer. I can do it safely through summer. I know my own body and I know these horses and I know this route, and I'll tell you when it's time to stop." He looked at her steadily. "You'll tell me," he said. "Not when I ask, but when you know." "When I know," she confirmed. "All right," he said. "That's all right. What else would I say? You're the best rider on this route and you've been making good decisions about it for a year without my input. I trust your judgment about your own body at least as much as I trusted about the creek crossing in June." Charlotte felt the familiar warmth of being trusted completely, which was not a small thing and which she never stopped being grateful for. She rode through June. She stopped riding in early July, not because Graham asked, but because she made her own assessment of the situation and determined that the risk had shifted in a direction she was not comfortable with. And she told Graham that morning over coffee, and he nodded, and asked her what she would like to do with her time instead. What she did with her time was become indispensable in a different way. She took over the scheduling entirely, which had been Graham's job, and which she improved significantly by applying the same route mapping logic she used on the trail to the problem of coordinating riders and horses, and weather and mail timing. She helped Esperanza with the kitchen garden, which she enjoyed in a different key than riding but found satisfying in its own patient way. She managed the accounts with a precision that made Graham quietly proud and slightly abashed, because he had been good at the accounts, and she was better. She also trained Henry Bowman to ride the canyon section. This took 3 weeks of patient, methodical instruction, riding beside him on the easier approach sections and talking him through the decisions, the footing, the pace, the way to read the shale, the precise moment to commit to the creek crossing without hesitation. Henry was a willing student and an improving rider, and by the end of 3 weeks he was taking the section in just over 4 hours, which was not her time but was a time that would keep the schedule. "You're a good teacher," Graham told her one evening when she came in from Henry's last training ride. "I had a good student," she said. "He listens, that's the main thing." "You listen too," he said. "It's something you and I share. We're both better at listening than most people give us credit for." She sat down across the table from him, her back aching with the specific ache of late pregnancy, and looked at him across the supper things. "Do you know what I've been thinking about?" she said. "Tell me." "Daniel," she said. "I've been thinking that he would have liked this, not just the route but this." She gestured, meaning the station and Graham and the whole accumulated life of the place. "He would have liked you particularly. You're the kind of person he always wanted to be." Graham was quiet for a moment. "I hope I would have liked him," he said. "The way you talk about him, I think I would have." "You would have," Charlotte said. "He was difficult sometimes and funny always, and he taught me everything about horses that I didn't already know, which was quite a lot." "I'll name the boy Daniel," Graham said, very simply. "If it's a boy, if you want." Charlotte felt her throat tighten. "Yes," she said, "I want that. It was a boy." He arrived in October on a cold, clear night with a moon so bright it lit the plain like pale daylight, and Graham was there for all of it, as present and practical and steady as he was for everything. And when Esperanza placed the child in his arms, his face did the thing it did when he was confronted with something that exceeded his vocabulary for it. It simply went still and full, like a vessel that has found what it was made to hold. "Daniel," Graham said quietly, looking at the child. "Daniel Graham Merritt," Charlotte said from the bed, with the exhaustion of a woman who has done the hardest physical work of her life and the particular luminous clarity that comes after it. "That's a good name," Graham said. "It is," Charlotte said. Daniel Graham Merritt was a large, loud, determined child from the first hour of his life, which both his parents found entirely characteristic of what they knew of his heritage on both sides. He had Charlotte's dark hair and Graham's gray-green eyes, and a set of opinions about his situation that he expressed continuously and without apology. Charlotte healed well and fast, which Esperanza said was because she was a strong woman and Graham said was because she did everything well, and Charlotte said was because she had a baby who required her to be functional and her body had understood this. By December she was back in the saddle, not on the express route, because the Pony Express itself was ending. The telegraph lines had been reaching steadily westward all through 1861, and when they connected in October of that year, the need for the express dissolved almost overnight. It was a fact of progress, and Charlotte understood it as such, even as she felt the loss of it, the loss of the route, the speed of it, the particular relationship between horse and terrain and urgency that had been the most alive she had ever felt. But the end of the express was not the end of everything. Graham had spent the previous year thinking carefully, his characteristic mode about what came next, and he had a plan. The station at Merritt's Crossing was well positioned on a route that would become increasingly important as settlement continued westward. Graham proposed to Collins's successor, Collins himself having retired to Ohio, which both Graham and Charlotte thought was appropriate given his mention of missing green, that the station be converted to a way station for the stage lines that were expanding across the territory. The proposal was accepted, and the transition took 3 months of hard work that Charlotte participated in fully, one-handed when necessary because Daniel was 4 months old and not yet willing to be put down for long intervals. The stage operation was different from the express in tempo and character, but required the same fundamental skills: horses, logistics, terrain knowledge, weather judgment, and Charlotte found that she had all of these and more to offer. She became, over the following year, the operations half of what everyone in the territory came to think of as the merit partnership. Graham handled the business relationships and the accounts and the big picture management. Charlotte handled the horses, the routes, the rider training, and the scheduling. Together they ran the best functioning way station on the Nebraska section of the trail. She also, in the spring of 1862, began to teach horsemanship and trail riding to any woman in the county who wanted to learn. This was not a formal arrangement at first. It grew from a conversation with the wife of a new settler who had arrived from Ohio and was frightened of her own horses in a way that was dangerous on the frontier. Charlotte spent an afternoon with her, and then another afternoon, and then the woman brought her sister, and then 3 others showed up because word traveled on the frontier the way it traveled everywhere, which was fast and thorough. Graham built a second small corral for the purpose. He did not ask whether he should. He simply came home one afternoon with lumber and Pete's help and built it, and when Charlotte came out to see what the noise was, he said, "You need more space," and she kissed him in front of Pete, who pretended not to see. The women who came to learn were an education in themselves. There were farm wives and settler wives and 2 women who were running their own homesteads alone, and a girl of 18 whose parents had brought her west from Ohio, and who had the same look Charlotte had had at 12 on the plains, the look of someone recognizing home. Charlotte taught them all what she knew, not just the mechanics of horsemanship but the philosophy of it, the attention and the patience and the confidence, and the understanding that the terrain was not an enemy but a conversation. "You were teaching the whole time," Graham told her one evening, after the last of the week's students had ridden home, even on the express route. "You were always mapping things, always thinking about how to explain them." "I was explaining them to myself," she said. "It just turns out other people find the explanation useful. Most of what you do turns out to be useful to other people," he said. "I've noticed this about you." Daniel was walking by then early, Esperanza said, though Charlotte thought it was perfectly on time for a child with that particular determination. And he had developed a habit of walking directly toward whatever horse was nearest, which kept everyone in a constant state of attentive alert. He had no fear of the animals, which was not the same as being safe around them, and Charlotte spent many patient hours of that second year introducing him to each horse individually, teaching him the approach and the voice and the hand position. He was 18 months old and entirely serious about it. "He'll be a rider," Pete said, watching Daniel solemnly present his small palm to the bay mare. "He comes by it honestly," Charlotte said. It was Pete who told Charlotte something she had not known, one afternoon in the winter of 1862, while they were working together in the barn. He told her that he had known she was a woman from the 3rd week, that he had seen her binding come loose after a hard rain and had made the connection, and then made the deliberate decision to make nothing of it. "Why?" Charlotte asked, genuinely wanting to know. Pete considered this for a long time, in his slow, careful way. "Because you rode that section in 3 hours 40 minutes, he said. "And because there wasn't anything I could do about it that wasn't going to make things worse for you, and I didn't see why things should be worse for you." He paused. "And because I have a daughter about your age and I think about what I would want for her." Charlotte looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "Nothing to thank me for," Pete said. "I just didn't say anything. That's not the same as doing something." "Sometimes it is," Charlotte said. A second child came in 1863, a girl they named Ellen, after no one specific, just a name that had always seemed to Charlotte like a name for someone capable. And Ellen proved from infancy to be her father's child in temperament, which was to say she was patient and observant and very slow to speak, but very specific when she did. Daniel adored her from the first day with the fierce, bewildered adoration that older children sometimes have for younger siblings, and he appointed himself her protector with a seriousness that made both his parents simultaneously proud and concerned. The station grew. Graham hired 2 more stock hands and a second cook, because Esperanza's husband had taken them on a cattle venture east, and Esperanza herself had decided to go with him, which Charlotte felt as a genuine loss that took several weeks to stop aching. The new cook was a quiet man named Samuel who made excellent biscuits and asked for nothing except to be left alone in his kitchen, which was an arrangement that suited everyone. Henry Bowman left in 1863 as well, to go back to Missouri and marry a woman he had been corresponding with for 2 years, and Charlotte threw him a proper send-off supper, and he cried again and again denied it. She gave him a letter of recommendation that Graham had helped her write, formally, on station letterhead, and Henry held it like something precious. The stage line brought new people through the station regularly, and Charlotte had a habit of remembering them, their horses, their routes, the things they mentioned in passing about conditions ahead. Graham had a habit of writing these things down in the ledger after she reported them, because her observations were reliable and specific, and he had learned to trust them as he trusted the weather glass. They argued sometimes, as people who are genuinely partners argue about decisions, about priorities, about the right approach to a particular problem. Graham could be stubborn in the particular way of principled people who have thought something through carefully and are not easily moved by casual disagreement. Charlotte could be immovable in the way of people who know they are right because they have checked the terrain with their own hands. Their arguments resolved themselves usually through the same mechanism. One of them produced new information that the other had not had, and the person without the information updated their position. It was not always comfortable in the moment, but it was always productive, and they had a tacit agreement that they never went to bed with a disagreement unresolved, which meant some very late nights and some very earnest conversations at 1 in the morning, while the children slept and the plane was silent around the station. The injustices of the time were real and present. Charlotte knew them from the inside: the absolute refusal of the express company to employ women officially, the legal reality of married women's property rights, the daily casual assumption in every conversation with officials and travelers that her opinions were supplementary to Graham's at best. Graham was not immune to these structures, and he knew it. He had the standing that she did not, and he used it deliberately on her behalf without her needing to ask, and she appreciated this without romanticizing it, because she understood that the right thing to do about an unfair system was to work within it where you had to and against it where you could, and he was doing both. She wrote a letter in 1864 to a woman's association in Ohio that had been corresponding about the question of women's property rights, and she described her year on the Pony Express route in the plain, factual terms she used for everything. She did not know what they would do with the letter. She sent it because the truth had value, and because the only way anything changed was if people with specific truths put them into specific words. The response, when it came 3 months later, was from a woman named Harriet who wrote in a hand as precise and direct as Charlotte's own, and who said that she had read the letter to a room of 40 women, and that the room had been completely silent while she read it and had erupted when she finished. She said that Charlotte's story was being shared, carefully, in the circles where such things could be safely shared. Charlotte showed the letter to Graham. He read it slowly. He folded it and handed it back to her and said, "The canyon section in 3 hours 40 minutes. "What?" she said. "That's what started all of this," he said. "You rode that section in 3 hours 40 minutes and nobody forgot it. Collins didn't forget it. Turner didn't forget it. Those 40 women aren't going to forget your letter." He looked at her. "You've always left a record. You've just been doing it on different terrain." Charlotte looked at the letter in her hands and thought about Daniel, about the April morning when she had pulled on his clothes with the wind coming off the plains, about the specific weight of the mochila on the saddle, and the sound of Jasper's hooves on hard ground, and the feeling of the route opening up ahead of her like a sentence that needed finishing. She thought about Graham appearing with a tin cup of coffee and a frown aimed at a fence post, and the porch conversations, and the barn at 5 in the morning, and the way he had looked at her in the lantern light and said her name. She thought about Daniel in the corral with his small palm presented to the bay mare, and Ellen on Graham's knee with her serious eyes cataloging the world. "I left a record," she said. "The best record on this division," Graham said, "possibly on any division." He was using Collins's words, and she recognized them, and the smile that came was the kind that started somewhere behind the sternum and moved outward until it was in everything. She put the letter from Harriet carefully in the station's letter box, where she kept things that mattered, and went out to the corral, where Daniel was attempting to explain something important to the bay mare, and the mare was listening with the patient attention of an animal that understood that the person speaking to her meant well, even if the message was unclear. Graham came out and stood beside her, watching their son and the horse, and the afternoon was the specific gold of late autumn, and the plain was wide in every direction, and the station was behind them with its solid practical walls and everything in it that they had built. "Next spring," Charlotte said. "What about next spring?" "I want to expand the riding school. I want to take students from the 2 counties east as well. I've been thinking about a regular schedule 1 week per month." "We'll need another instructor eventually," Graham said. He was already thinking through the logistics. She could hear it in his voice. "Henry would come back for that," she said. "He's a good teacher and he's back in Missouri with nothing much to do." "Write him a letter," Graham said. "I will," she said. They stood together as the sun came lower, and Daniel finally achieved whatever communication he had been attempting with the mare. Because the mare lowered her great head toward his hand in the gesture Charlotte had taught him, and the boy let out a sound of pure delight that carried across the cold air, and made both his parents smile the same smile at the same moment. The winter of 1864 was hard cold enough to keep the stage lines irregular, and the station work intense, fires burning in every room from before dawn to after dark, the horses needing extra care and extra feed. Charlotte managed the stable through it with the competence she brought to every terrain, and Graham managed the household accounts with the same, and together they brought the station and everyone in it through to March without significant loss. March came in like a door opening, the first warm days feeling almost reckless after the tight cold of winter, the horses wanting to run and the ground wanting to show something green. Charlotte was expecting their 3rd child, which she had told Graham at Christmas with the same directness she brought to everything, and he had received it with the same quiet joy he had brought to the first 2. "A girl again," he said. "I have no way of knowing," Charlotte said. "I know," he said. "I was just hoping to be surprised." "We'll be surprised," she said. They were. It was another boy, arriving in August with the same efficiency that Daniel had demonstrated, quickly, loudly, and with an immediate comprehensive opinion about all of it. They named him Samuel, after the quiet cook who had been with the station 3 years and who, when told of the name, went temporarily speechless, and then made biscuits for the entire station household for 3 consecutive mornings. Daniel was now old enough to have questions, and he had many of them, and most of them were about horses, which Charlotte answered with the same patience and detail she gave her adult students. He had begun riding under supervision the previous spring, which had been one of the best mornings Charlotte could remember, the boy on the bay mare's back, Graham standing at the mare's head, Charlotte on her own horse alongside, Daniel's face in the first moment of real movement wearing an expression that she recognized from the inside. "He's got it," she said. Graham looked at her. "What does that mean?" "You'll see," she said. "He'll always want to go faster, that's the tell." Daniel kicked his heels against the mare's sides, which was not what they had told him to do, and the mare moved from a walk to a trot, and Daniel's face went from concentration to absolute radiance. And Graham laughed, and Charlotte felt something enormous move through her that had no name, but that was the convergence of Daniel, her brother, and Daniel, her son, and the plain and the horses, and the 7 years since April of 1860, when she had been nothing but a woman in borrowed clothes on a borrowed route, with nothing to lose and everything to find. She wrote in the station ledger that evening, the same kind of ledger Graham had always kept, the record of miles and weather and conditions and times, but she wrote in it for herself that night, not for the company. She wrote the date and the weather and the fact of Daniel's first trot on the bay mare, and then she wrote below it in her own hand, "Best ride of the year." Graham read it over her shoulder. "Of any year," he said. "Of any year," she agreed. The years settled into each other after that with the comfortable weight of a life being actually lived, the school growing, the station earning its reputation as the most reliable on the trail, Graham's letters to Collins's successor becoming a recognized resource on station management, Charlotte's letters to Harriet's circle becoming something that circulated among women on both sides of the Missouri. Ellen turned out to be gifted with numbers in the way Daniel Garrison Sr. had been, and Charlotte sat with her in the evenings doing the station accounts and watching her daughter's quick, precise mind find the patterns with a pleasure that was the pleasure of recognition. Samuel turned out to be gifted with horses in a way that transcended instruction. He had a quality of attention with animals that the animals understood, and the most difficult horses at the station became calm around him with a consistency that Pete, now in his 60s and slower than before but never wrong about horses, said was the rarest thing he had seen in 50 years of working with them. Graham's hair went gray at the temples while Charlotte stayed dark, and they argued about this occasionally with the lightness of people who are happy enough to be light about anything. His laugh, which had taken months to first hear and longer to hear regularly, was now the sound Charlotte associated most completely with the word home, not the building, not the plane, but that specific sound in that specific voice. She rode still. Not the express route, which was long gone into history, but she rode the territory regularly checking trail conditions, visiting the farmers and settlers who had become part of the station's extended community, covering ground that she had known so long it moved beneath her like a conversation rather than a challenge. She rode into her 40s with the same efficiency she had brought to the canyon section in her early 20s, her body adapted over decades to the specific demands of long-distance riding in hard country, and the horse beneath her always felt, in those miles, like the truest version of everything she was. There was one more thing, which happened in the autumn of 1867, which was that a journalist from a St. Louis paper came through the station on his way west and heard the story from Turner's brother-in-law at a swing station and came specifically to Merritt's Crossing to find Charlotte. He was a young man, earnest and a little overwhelmed by the territory, and he had a notebook and a pencil, and the look of someone who understood that the story in front of him was better than anything he had expected to find. Charlotte sat with him on the porch, the same porch where she had first sat with Graham in the June evenings of 1860, and told him the story. She told it plainly and completely, beginning with Daniel and the April morning and ending with the school and the students and the station and the life she had built. Graham sat nearby, not interrupting, listening the way he listened. When she was done, the journalist looked up from his notebook. "And the Pony Express. Do you miss it?" Charlotte thought about the canyon section, the shale on the north approach, the creek in June running 4 feet above normal, the specific quality of Jasper's gallop when they had found their rhythm together and the miles were moving beneath them like music. "Every day," she said, "and I'm grateful for every day. Those aren't contradictory things." The journalist wrote it down. He looked at Graham. "And you, Mr. Merritt, the station master who found out." Graham looked at Charlotte, and the look was the same look it had always been, layered and specific and entirely directed at her. "I told her what I still believe," Graham said. "She was the best rider I had ever had on this route." Past tense, the journalist said. Graham's mouth did the small thing it did before the real smile came. "The best rider I have ever known," he said. "Past, present, and however long there is after." Charlotte looked at him across the porch in the autumn afternoon with the plain behind him and the station and the children inside, and the horses in the corral, and the long years of this life that was all of it exactly what she had wanted without knowing it on that April morning when she had pulled on her brother's clothes and pointed her horse west into the enormous future. "That's accurate," she said. He smiled. She smiled back. The journalist stayed for supper, and Esperanza's replacement made biscuits, and Daniel spent the meal explaining to the journalist the correct approach to a difficult horse, and Ellen corrected the accounts in the ledger with her quick, precise hand, and Samuel fell asleep at the table before the biscuits were done, which was typical, and the station was warm with lamplight, and the sound of people who had made something good together and knew it. After, when the journalist had gone to his bunk and the children were asleep, and the station was quiet, Charlotte and Graham sat on the porch one more time in the way they had sat on every version of this porch since the beginning, with coffee going cold in their cups and the plain enormous and dark around them, and the sky overhead doing what the Nebraska sky always did, which was to be more stars than seemed possible, and to make a person feel both very small and very specifically and deliberately present. "Do you think he'll write it well?" Charlotte asked. "I think it doesn't matter," Graham said. "The story is true regardless of how he writes it. You rode that route for 7 months and the mail got through, and nobody argues with that." "Nobody argues with performance," Charlotte said. "Nobody argues with performance," he agreed. The fire was low in the station behind them, and the horses were settled in the barn, and the night was clear and cold, and going on forever in every direction. And Charlotte leaned her head against Graham's shoulder, and felt the warmth of him and the solidity of him, and the particular peace of being entirely where you mean to be with entirely the person you mean to be with, which is not a small thing, and which she had never once taken for granted. Above them, the Nebraska sky went on as it always had, indifferent to any one story but capacious enough to hold all of them, and big enough to have held hers, the woman who had ridden west in her brother's name and found, in the finding, something entirely her own.